The first agricultural revolution began when humans transitioned from nomadic hunting and gathering to sedentary agricultural production of domesticated plants and animals, livestock. This included very labor intensive practices that required a lot of effort and yielded only very little in the beginning. However, this agriculture did allow for a more stable food source, and the population soon began to grow. The second agricultural revolution incorporated technology into agricultural strategies. It was triggered by the Industrial Revolution, where new innovations such as fertilizers, mechanical plows, and seed drills allowed for massive loads of crops. The enclosure system, which fenced in certain pieces of land, also allowed farmers to grow more with the same amount of labor as before. This helped to save money and gain revenue, and it also caused further population growth on both a global and local scale. The third agricultural revolution occurred during the 60s and 70s, and it was the Green Revolution, as it was called. It was very productive and efficient, and farms were able to create enough food for the world. New methods such as agribusiness, commercial farms, led to globalization and GMOs, genetically modified organisms. Countries like those in Europe were able to feed themselves, and it also led to the more prevalent use of chemical fertilizers and biotechnology still seen today. Liberal models of development. One was self-efficiency. This is where the development in a country occurs where money is spent evenly in different sectors within a country to boost industries. This leads to moderate development, and this also includes a decrease in poverty. Countries help to institute tariffs and quotas that discourage the use of international trade. This also prevents businesses from rising to a global scale under this government control. On the counter is international trade. This is development in which nations identify the resource they have, in which countries want time, and it produces and promotes the specialization of certain industries. It helps countries form stronger relationships and technical skill. For example, a country can use IT to sort of boost itself. Many LDCs, such as India, use IT to offset their losses through crop value and inadequate funding in other areas of their economy. And a new international division of labor is the transfer of some low-wage industrial jobs from MDCs to LDCs to provide for cheap labor. We see this in the form of outsourcing. Companies such as Nike might produce their products in Bangladesh because it's a lot cheaper to make it there and ship it over. Rostow's stages of growth. This is a stage of development map for emerging and developing countries, usually LDCs. There are 5 stages. The first begins with little development with traditional agricultural practices, generally subsistence farming, and military religious centered activities. Military and religions are generally held to very high esteem in these cases. Stage 2, preconditions for takeoff. It starts with an elite group, so either capitalists or communist dictators, that boosts economic activities. Countries begin to invest in technology and infrastructure. This helps to promote production and transition to a secondary sector. Stage 3, takeoff conditions with rapid growth in limited areas, focused in Stage 2. In this stage, technology and industrialization really increases in certain areas, but other areas remain traditional as well. Stage 4, a drive to maturity. So this technology starts to spread to all areas. It results in more industries. Workers specialize in certain areas and tasks, and this diversifies the economy. Stage 5, mass production begins in multiple industries, and materials are sold to consumers, and services begin to increase as well. This also shifts the country from secondary to tertiary sectors, and this is really where many MDCs are located today. Fordism. Fordism describes industries of development based mainly on assembly line, with many people working separate jobs. They specialize on a certain task, and that's basically all they perform the whole day at work. This is named, of course, after the American innovator Henry Ford, who founded the Ford Motor Company. And even though he wasn't the first to use the assembly line, he really helped to make it mainstream in his production of the Model T. Post-Fordism kind of describes today. This is industries of development based mainly on specialized workers in different skilled tasks, what we have today. This is more lenient towards a service-based economy, which is very prevalent. Structuralist model of development. This really goes along with dependency theory, and it states that relations between countries and regions have been formed so tightly that the political and economic associations between them can limit the amount of power the countries or regions can have. Politics and the economy are linked so tightly together that when one thing changes, it will affect everything else, and these countries don't have independent power anymore. And locational interdependence theory. This was created by Hotelling, and it was a theory that states that industrial location is ensured by getting a share of business in one location. This kind of goes along with like the ice cream stand on the beach example, and it's a model that looks at revenue, not cost, and it predicts that producers and suppliers who are located in close proximity will monopolize to attract more customers. So in this case, the stand at A will generally attract more customers on its side, while the location at C will attract more customers on its side. At B, it's really just a tug-of-war game to see where people want to go get their ice cream. Weber model of industrial location. This goes along with the least cost theory, and it states that industrial locations are most likely to be located in areas of least cost in terms of transportation, labor, and capital operating costs. Locations and regions of lowest cost have different specifications that are determined by the product's weight through bulk gaining or bulk reducing. It really depends heavily on the product that's being produced or traded. Additionally, this theory states that agglomeration, where different things are crowded together, is likely to occur as businesses are drawn to these ideal locations, generally in city centers or financial districts where they can sort of work together with other companies in the area. Here is a Weber visual, and this is a very famous example with like Thirsty Town producing spring water, hops and grains fields for beer and shipping it. Generally, if you make really heavy products, you'll want it closer to market because less shipping costs, while lighter markets, you can afford to make it in a different place and ship it over. It's really a balance between how much it costs to ship and what's economical, where the prices are good. Profit maximization. This goes along with lost zone of maximization. This theory states that businesses are located in regions of highest revenue. Pretty true. And it's hard to pinpoint one specific ideal location. There are generally chains of optimal locations that are formed, creating a spatial margin of profitability, different places where this zone of maximization can be found. So a firm might maximize profit by producing quantity at which the marginal cost equals the marginal revenue, where everything is balanced. This goes on with economic theory. Bid rent theory. This is a geographic economic model that portrays the changes on demands for real estates as distance from the central business district, the central part of the city, increases. Residents are most likely to pay in an area such as this. Bid rent visual. So as people go further from the CBD, people generally start to pay less. This is generally kind of like suburbs where everything starts to cost less the further you get away from the center of the city. And we see that city living truly does cost more. Pilchard's model of urban evolution. This is a model that is very closely linked with history, and it describes transportation technology that dominates during each time period where cities had initial growth. Stage 1 was the sail wagon era. From 1790 to 1830, cities born during this time were built near ports and waterways because that was where all the trade was. Stage 2, Iron Horse era, 1830 to 1870, cities during this time were built near rivers and railroads because finally railroads could link goods shipped on rivers to different places across land. Stage 3, Steel Rail era, 1870 to 1920, industrial cities were built near railroads because railroads really started to connect different large parts of places across lands. And stage 4, the auto-air amenity era, 1920 to present, car and air travel revolutionized where people live and how people travel. And it really helped with highways and suburbs and their development across different landscapes in the world. Central place theory. It was a theory proposed by Christaller that explains the patterns of urban land use in the central place theory. Central places are generally urban centers, usually a city, that provides services to people in the hinterland. The hinterland is the area surrounding the central city, and in the hinterland, there are usually tessellations or different areas of other cities, smaller cities, markets, and towns that sort of revolve around this general city. Here is a visual of it. As you can see, it's like a bunch of hexagons where the city is the primary center. There are towns spaced out from it, also market towns, which are linked by trade, and smaller villages which surround these market towns. A concentric circle. This was a model that is described by the Burgess model. A CBD, the central business district, is expanded to other areas through different rings. It portrays a model of internal structure of cities in which social groups are spatially arranged in rings. It shows how a city is distributed through different rings and ranges close to it. So here is a visual of it. This is kind of like the agricultural theory of von Thunen. It's actually very similar, where the central business district is kind of like where the dairy production is, followed by zones of transition, independent workers' homes, suburbs, and better residences, and eventually commuter zones where people who work in the city travel from. The sector model, it was created by Hoyt, and it's based on concentric circles, kind of like before, but as cities grew in these sectors formed to be based on the benefits of an area. It allowed more connection between the different sectors and focused on residential patterns, explaining where the majority of people live in a city. So it's not as circular like the previous model. It sort of takes on these other different shapes according to, of course, where people benefit and the good locations around a city. So as seen here, the central business district once again is in the center, but now you see the lower, middle, and upper classes sort of choose their different places in the city where they like to operate, and industry sort of just builds around that. The peripheral model, it was created by Harris. It states that suburbs and business areas surround the inner city, and these areas are tied together by a beltway or ring road, kind of like the concentric ring model, but it is slightly different. As you can see here, there is a central highway that surrounds this location. Central City, once again, is in the center, but different important parts of the city, for example, airports or other shopping centers or residential areas, sort of tend to gravitate toward the edge of the city, surrounded by that highway, which helps to link everything together. The multiple nuclei model. This is a model of internal structures of cities in which cities and their social groups are arranged around a collection of nodes of activities. Where people like to hang out, this is how this model is created. There is an example of a multiple nuclei model. It's kind of like a sector model, except these shapes are even less circular. They're really formed based on where the social events are in a city. The urban realms model, it's a model in which suburban downtown areas are able to become independent. They're their own urban realms, if you will, and they each show independence but eventually combine to form a multiple nuclei model where they revolve around a center city. We can see this here, where the central city still maintains its place, but many edge cities have popped up around it, and they all have their own sort of environment that together helps to form this multiple nuclei city. It's these other cities with their small nuclei who come together to form this model. Latin American cities model. This is a combination of Latin American culture and globalization. It combines the sector model with concentric zones. It includes a thriving central business district with a commercial spine. There's sort of like this weird alleyway in this model that houses all the commercial areas of a certain city. The quality of houses decreases as one moves outward from the CBD. So the inner city, if you will, is actually the outer city. The slums are located on the outskirts of these cities. And these areas of worst housing occur in the so-called disamenity sectors, as seen here. So we see that spine, which ultimately leads to the CBD and is bordered on the outside by this mall, this market, if you will. And all the tough parts, I guess, to live are sort of on the outside, while the nice places are located more closer to the market in the center. There's also a Southeast Asian cities model because many Southeast Asian cities follow it. And it's similar to the Latin American cities model in that they feature high-class residential zones that are closely related to the center and middle-class residential zones which are a little bit farther away. The difference between the two models is that this model features middle-income housing in suburban areas. So where in the previous outskirts there's usually poor people, now middle-income people who live in suburbs tend to reside there as well. As seen here, this is kind of like the previous one, except now, of course, you have the city center, which in many Southeast countries, because they're bordered by a lot of oceans, such as the Indian and Pacific, it's usually located around a port zone, where other areas sort of spread out away from this central port zone. And finally, the African cities model. It has 3 central business districts. It's really a remnant of the colonial CBD, as different colonies and colonizers started to come in and make Africa this huge place of colonial trade. It's often informal, and it sometimes has a periodic market zone that's transitional and sometimes includes different business centers wherever the commerce is conducted. So usually in African countries, it occurs in stalls in different storefronts and sometimes even near the curb. So it's not always permanent like these other cities. The neighborhoods are also ethnic and mixed. This is, of course, because of the indigenous people and the colonizers mixing. It's also often next to a mining and manufacturing zone, as many of these countries are still developing, and all of that is then ringed around by zone characterized by squatter settlements, the slums, kind of like South America, if you will, and informal satellite townships that also revolve around these central business districts. So here is a model sub-Saharan African city. As you can see, there are many different market zones, traditional central business districts, and an old colonial central business district, and everything else just kind of revolves around it. And finally, gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is a process of redrawing legislative boundaries for the purpose of benefiting the party in power. So there was a politician named Jerry, and he tried to redraw his sort of district into a weird shape so he could ensure his re-election, draw it where his voters lived, kind of like this. And people were like, hey, that's a salamander, but they're like, no, it's a gerrymander. So that's how the term gerrymandering came to be. In many places, such as more developed countries, this is an illegal practice, so definitely people should not be doing this, but yet they still try to do it to make sure they can get elected again. Well, that's been AP Human Geography Crash Course, all 70 terms. Thanks so much for watching, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Thumbs up if you liked, comment, question below, share with your friends, and make sure to check out my other stuff as well, and subscribe. Until next time, see ya.